Hi everyone, my name is Avneet Kaur. Today I'm gonna talk about my psychology assignment, which is based on the topic sensory memory in cognitive psychology. The main objective of the assignment is to compare experimental and non-experimental methods in the study of the sensory memory. Firstly, the overview of sensory memory. The definition of a sensory memory is to briefly hold incoming sensory information that could be visual, auditory, etc., for a very short time, even milliseconds to a few seconds. So, there are basically two types of sensory memory, that is iconic memory, which is associated with visual, and echoic memory, which is associated with auditory. So the purpose of sensory memory is to act as a buffer, which allow the brain to process and decide which information is worthy of further encodings. So there are two types of researches in this assignment, that is experimental and non-experimental research. So the experimental research involves manipulation of variables to establish cause-effect relationships, whereas a non-experimental research is to observe and measure variables without manipulation, often correlational or observational. So its relevance to sensory memory is that both of these methods provide valuable insights into how sensory information is processed and stored. Furthermore, firstly, I would like to introduce to the experimental study, which is authored by George Sperling. It is taken from the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Learning and Memory. The qualification of the author George Sperling is PhD in psychology from Harvard University, which is affiliated to University of Iowa, later at MIT. So the research background of this author is he has worked on iconic memory and the role of attention in memory processes, that is foundational in cognitive psychology. So it is peer reviewed because it is reputable and peer reviewed scientific journal. So the details of experimental study is that the main major issue of experimental study is that it is mentioned that how does attention affect the duration and accuracy of iconic memory. So there are various methods which could be used in experimental study. That is, in this method, participants viewed a grid of letters for a fraction of a second. After a brief delay, participants were asked to recall the letters. So the conditions were varied based on the time delay between the presentation and recall. So it is mainly based on the testing role of attention. So what were the key findings in the experimental study is that participants were better at recalling letters when the delay was shorter, suggesting that attention significantly impacts the accuracy of a sensory memory. So, iconic memory lasts only a brief moment, and attention is essential for encoding sensory information into short term memory. So the conclusion of experimental study is to mention that attention enhances the fidelity of sensory memory, particularly in visual memory. Furthermore, to introduce non-experimental study, firstly, I would like to say that it is a entirely fictional non-experimental study. It doesn't have any favorable author. So I put the names of the author just as a fiction. So the background of this authors is that they mainly focus on developmental changes in cognitive functions like memory across the lifespan. So it is also peer reviewed, but it's just considered peer reviewed, but in actual it is just an fictional. So the issue which non-experimental study found is to find how does the duration of sensory memory vary across age groups. So the hypothesis for this experiment is that there is a correlation between age and the duration of sensory memory. In order to talk about the method, in this experiment, a correlational study with the three age groups were taken, and that the age groups were children, young adults, and older adults. So each group was tested on how long they could retain sensory stimuli, both visual and auditory. So the memory duration was measured by the time taken for participants to forget information presented in rapid succession. So the key findings for the non-experimental study is that the younger adults had the longest sensory memory duration, followed by children and then older adults. Sensory memory duration decreased with age. So it is the main finding of the non-experimental study. If I talk about the statistics, sensory memory duration for younger adults was significantly higher compared to older adults. If I talk about the conclusion of non-experimental study, it is that age affects the duration of sensory memory, with younger individuals showing better memory retention than older ones. So, if I compare experimental and non-experimental methods, so firstly, the experimental method by Sperling shows that its main strength is to it allows manipulation of variables and establishes causal relationships. If I talk about the weakness of experimental study, it is that laboratory conditions may lack ecological validity artificial setup. So the strength of non-experimental method is that it can study natural relationships that could be age and sensory memory in real world context. The weakness of non-experimental method is that it cannot establish causality, only correlation. So, when to use each method? So, there are basically some conditions to use these methods. For the experimental methods, this is best for studying causal relationships and manipulating variables under controlled conditions, whereas the non-experimental methods are basically useful for observing natural real-world relationships or when experimental manipulation is not possible. So, lastly, in conclusion, sensory memory is a key concept in cognitive psychology, and both experimental and non-experimental research methods which provide important insights into its function. So, the reflection is that understanding these methods can be helpful to highlight the strengths and weakness of different research designs in exploring complex psychological phenomena. So that's it for today. Thank you.